Welcome to today's Police and Crime Committee meeting, where we will be having a discussion with invited guests on online fraud. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. And also, can I ask anybody, and I hopefully sound as if I know what I'm talking about, with hotspots turned on their phone? I'm sure our guests know exactly what this is. Can you turn them off? Because it interferes with our PA system. So thank you for that. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence have been received today.
Jolly good. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, jolly good. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of February 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Yes. Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. And so we now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer session on online fraud in London. So I'd like to welcome our guests, Kenny Bowie, Director of Strategy and Policing Oversight for MOPAC, Commander Catherine Roper, Central Specialist Crime Metropolitan Police Service, Detective Superintendent John Roch, Head of Economic Crime MPS, Assistant Commissioner Pete Doherty from City of London Police, and Commander Clinton Blackburn from City of London Police, and John McGeachy, Senior Campaigns Officer of Age UK Limited, London. So thank you all very much for attending. I'm going to start the questioning off. And if I can start with City of London Police, I'm not sure which one of you would like to answer this to start with. How has the nature and scale of online fraud in London changed over the last few years, with particular reference to the impact of COVID-19? So who'd like to start that?
Thank you very much, Chair. So I think to set the context, we have over 55 different types of fraud and cybercrime reported to Action Fraud, which, as we all know, is the single reporting hub for fraud and cybercrime against people and businesses across England and Wales. Interestingly, at the start of COVID, although we saw a slight reduction in fraud reporting, we did, in generally over the last 2 years, see a 9% increase in fraud being reported by members of the public. And in my mind, that relates to several things. One is around more people working from home, using the internet, and therefore a greater level of victimisation. I think second of all were fraudsters who were seizing all opportunities around COVID. So we saw lots of cases around the counterfeit supply of vaccines, the counterfeit supply of personal protective equipment like face masks. We saw more smishing and phishing, which of course are opportunistic fraudsters reaching out to members of the public, particularly elderly and vulnerable people, looking to steal bank account information. And actually, we believe that in the next few years, we will see a 25% increase in fraud reporting from public and businesses. And actually, and forgive me for all the statistics, we also believe that fraud is hugely underreported. In fact, we only believe that what we get into Action Fraud is only 15% of the true scale of fraud. And just to finish my input, Chair, I think the continued globalization of goods, people and services, the continuous evolution of technology, the transition of our everyday lives onto the internet, and indeed changes in social norms will continue to drive the increase in demand from fraud and wider economic crime, both in terms of volume and complexity. And in summary, that's my view around how we've seen fraud change in the last 2 years, and indeed how it might change in the longer term.
Thank you. I wonder if you can just clarify this for me. I've always thought of the City of London dealing with fraud, but I've always thought it was more of a business nature. Do you pick up all fraud, or can you just tell the committee exactly where are the lines on picking up fraud?
Absolutely, Chair. And I have to say that as a member of the public, if I didn't work in the field of fraud, I would probably find it very difficult to understand the policing structure, indeed wider law enforcement structure around that local, regional, national response to fraud. So to answer your question, every police force in the country, so 43 forces across England and Wales, and every regional organised crime unit, which is a collaboration of forces across the country, they all have teams to investigate fraud. And essentially, fraud investigation teams within police forces tend to investigate the kind of higher volume, lower harm fraud investigations. We have teams within regional organised crime units that tend to focus more on the kind of higher harm, organised nature of fraud. And then the City of London Police, as national lead force for fraud, it means we do three things, essentially. The first thing we mean is we host action fraud, so all the reporting of fraud and cybercrime comes into us. We then analyse those cases, we link them together, and we decide what cases we send out to those local teams and regional teams for investigation that I mentioned before. The second thing we do is we have a huge fraud investigation team in the City of London Police that not only investigates the business crime you mentioned earlier on within the City of London, but we take on some of the more complex cases on behalf of policing, where police force and regional teams don't have the capacity nor the capability to investigate those frauds. And we also have a number of funded units in the City of London Police. So we have a team called the Dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit. That's a collaboration between the Met Police and the City of London Police, funded by UK Finance, who work nationally to disrupt and enforce against a threat from mostly online credit card fraud and like scams. We have a team funded by the Association of British Insurers to investigate a myriad of insurance-type frauds. And lastly, a police intellectual property crime unit that investigates a range of counterfeit-based crimes like the vaccine counterfeit jobs I mentioned before. And then the third element of this tripartite that makes up the lead force is the Economic Crime Academy. And we provide training to not only UK policing, law enforcement, private sector, and international territories around fraud investigation. And of course, lastly, the National Economic Crime Centre, who I know is not here today, is the system lead for fraud. And their responsibility is to bring together all those partners, both across public sector and private sector, fighting fraud against people and businesses. So we are coordinated locally to nationally as a wider system.
Gosh, given how much fraud is increasing, unfortunately, is your team increasing at the same rate?
Thank you, Chair. That is the question of the hour indeed. So it is absolutely true that 40% of fraud, as per the recent crime survey for England and Wales, is 40% of all recorded crime and 53% of recorded crime when you include cybercrime. But actually, only 1% of the total resourcing across policing is dedicated to investigating fraud. And sadly, that is our starting point. However, with that said, in recent years, there has been a huge investment from government and Home Office to build capacity at a local, regional and national level around fraud prevention and fraud investigation. And if I could give you one short example, in the next 3 years, there will be an additional 20 police officers and police staff investigating fraud at a regional level. And in overall, that means 250 extra people in policing fighting fraud in the next 3 years. But in conclusion, no, it's absolutely not enough.
Okay, so if you do the training as well, are you training the new, because obviously there's 20,000 new police officers, are any of them being specifically trained? Because keeping up with technology, I almost gave up, because it's just moving so quickly. Villains are obviously keeping up with the pace, and I know the IT systems of policing in general are not, if I can put it, the best they could or should be. Are we training the new recruits that are coming through specifically, or are we picking out the ones that have clearly got an IT brain? Are we picking up those ones up when we're actually retraining?
So for the resources dedicated to fighting fraud full-time as their day job, we provide specialist training via our academy to help build the expertise. In terms of people working in local policing, and as you say, who are joining the police service, but not necessarily working in fraud, through the College of Policing as part of their induction process, they do get some training around fraud, but it's more education and awareness as opposed to proper focused training. So, for example, as a new recruit, you will be given a briefing around the Proceeds of Crime Act, so you understand money laundering and the powers the police has to take assets from criminals. You'll be taught about the Fraud Act 2006 around what the general fraud crime offences are, but you won't be given any specialist fraud investigation training until you become a dedicated fraud investigator. And of course, that is an issue because, you know, a few years ago, National Counter-Terrorism Policing said we need every police officer to be a counter-terrorism police officer. Well, the time has come for us to have every police officer to be a counter-fraud police officer. And that means we need to provide more training and more continuous professional development for our staff, even for those not working within the specialist field of fraud.
Okay, and do all these officers have to be police officers? Do you use civilians that are, high IT experts?
We do, Chair. So under the Police Uplift programme, that's only police officers. But actually, lots of other work to create those investigation teams, they all have a blend of police officers and police staff. So we have police staff investigators who are not warranted officers, but still investigate fraud. They're able to interview suspects. They're able to go on warrants. We have financial investigators who effectively follow money flows, are both police officers and police staff. And we have a mixture of police officers and police staff who do work around delivering prevention messaging to local communities and businesses all across the country.
Okay, that's much clearer for me now, thank you. I better get back to script, otherwise I shall be telling myself off. So, since 2019, there's been a reduction in referrals to the Met, coinciding with the introduction of a new dissemination system and processes within the NFIB. Where have the remaining referrals been allocated since 2019?
So I can come onto that initially from a City of London Police as we host Action Fraud and the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. So I think it's fair to say that so we get 25,000 crimes into Action Fraud, either via the contact centre or the online reporting tool. But in totality, 40,000 crimes into our system because we get other intelligence that comes into our department outside Action Fraud as well. And it is normal to see fluctuations in terms of what cases we give to each police force. So normally, we send out about 5,000 crimes to police forces and law enforcement cases to investigate. And normally the Metropolitan Police receives about 35% of the cases we send out. But in terms of your question, we did see a slight reduction in reporting into Action Fraud around victims in London. And my view is the main reason for that is that during the pandemic, lots of people who work in London were working from home outside London. So you see, when we decide what police force should investigate a crime, the main priority we look at to work out what police force should own the investigation is where the victim is and where the suspect offending is happening. So normally, if you worked in London, you might decide to phone Action Fraud in an evening or on your lunch break where you've been victimised through your smartphone or online whilst you've been at work in London. But of course, during the pandemic, a lot of people who work in London don't live in London. And so the victimised location was wherever they live. That could be, in the southeast region, or it could be the northeast, or wherever they are. And we think that's probably the main reason why we saw that reduction of reporting to Action Fraud. And we don't believe that reduction is going to continue now. People are coming back into the workplace in a post-pandemic era.
Okay, thank you. I mean, for obvious reasons, we want to concentrate on London today. And when we see the proportion of fraud crimes, the percentage in London compared to the rest of the country, it's staggeringly high. If I can come now to John McGeachy from Age UK, and thank you for coming in so late in the day and agreeing to come here. I'm very grateful. How has the scale of online fraud affecting older Londoners changed since the pandemic?
I think the biggest changes in relation to the impact are the way it's exacerbated or caused things like social isolation, some of the impacts of digital exclusion, and obviously the cost of living crisis will have an impact as well. Across the country, I think 370 million was lost by people aged 60 and over in the 12 months up to November last year. The average age of someone on what I think are called suckers lists for some fraud is 74. And I guess the broader context is there are about 5 million people across the country over 65 that believe they've been targeted by scams. And there's some research that says every 40 seconds an older person is targeted by fraud. In terms of sort of scales and numbers, it's different from different age groups. I think something that's quite particular to the older age group, and that's particularly because of who's targeted and who's most vulnerable, is that the impact can be more profound and more significant. And if you know, for example, if you live alone, you're more likely to be a victim, and nearly half of people in London over the age of 75 live alone. If people living with dementia or cognitive decline, people that have suffered a recent bereavement, people that have experienced some trauma, they're all more likely to be affected. And another aspect of this is low levels of digital skills is making people really vulnerable. Okay,
and do you send out specific messages to the older community, telling them particularly to beware, etc.? And do you think that it's difficult to prove if that works, because things then don't happen?
I think so. It's hard to see how this will develop in the next 12 months. Lots of the local age UKs have lists of different types of scams which they've recorded or have been reported to them, which they do disseminate. The age UKs in Wandsworth, Barnet, Camden, Lewisham and Southwark all do fraud prevention and victim support programs, and there's a range of materials and guides around staying safe online. But it's knowing the signs, knowing how to protect yourself, and obviously another side is knowing how to report as well.
Yeah, I have noticed things coming out from local safer neighbourhood teams, which I think is very good. This is in London, and messages coming out through the OWL system for people belonging to safer neighbourhoods and things like that. And I do think that helps, because if nothing else, if it's picked up by somebody who's got an elderly relative, I think that it can only help, can't it? I'm now going to go to Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So my first question is for City of London Police and for the Met. So shall I, either Assistant Commissioner Peter Doherty or Detective Superintendent John Roch, but maybe you could choose between you who this one is most appropriate for. What does the latest intelligence and evidence suggest about future online fraud trends in London?
If it's okay, I'll go first, and then I think maybe John will come in after me. At the moment, the three most common frauds we see in our system are cheque, plastic card and bank account related fraud, online shopping and auctions fraud, and then application frauds. And as we all know, romance fraud is a huge issue for us at the moment. I think, particularly after COVID, we're going to see so many more people working from home now, and therefore particularly scams like romance fraud or people living alone being targeted by opportunistic fraudsters is definitely a trend I think we're going to see in the future. Another trend that I would allude to is cryptocurrencies and crypto assets. So increasingly more so now, the use of cryptocurrencies, and I believe there's currently over 8,000 different coins out there at the moment, is becoming more common in our everyday lives. And actually that provides risk for consumers, and it also provides new opportunities for subjects and criminals to launder their proceeds of crime. But actually, I don't think we'll see a huge difference to what we're seeing now. It's completely dependent upon the rise of technology. And actually, any time a new piece of technology comes to the market, that could be a new mobile device, it could be a new hardware, fraudsters will absolutely look to exploit that. And that's why our relationship with industry is ever so important going forward, to make sure we are doing everything we can to preempt what those vulnerabilities are going to be and do our best to root out those opportunities for fraudsters. But that's it for me, and I'll pass over to John from the Met.
Thank you.
Thank you. You won't be surprised to hear me agree with the summary Mr. Doherty just provided. They are the main trends that we see. What I'd add to this is, and it ties into the Chairman's question at the start, actually how has fraud changed over the previous 2 to 5, maybe even 10 years? And what we've seen is that far more physical, or rather less physical presence and more online commission of fraud. And of course what that means is the fraudsters that much more difficult to identify, and therefore we need to be more innovative in how we actually look to investigate the fraud. So again, Mr. Doherty's made a very insightful reference to crypto and the threats that pose. It's cryptocurrency itself poses a threat in so much as we see frauds encouraging people to invest in cryptocurrency, but also, as has been suggested, many frauds cash out to crypto, because once funds are transferred into cryptocurrency, it's very difficult for law enforcement to trace and track those funds because it has the capability to travel internationally in seconds. So I think for me, one of the biggest trends that I would be looking to be addressing is how we can improve the policing of that cryptocurrency marketplace and the online enablement of frauds. And that's a whole system approach as opposed to just law enforcement.
Thank you. I'd like to go to John McGeachy now from Age UK, and to just ask what types of, we've heard, about romance fraud targeting people, potentially living on their own, and these various kinds of online frauds. And I just wonder, yes, sort of what types of online fraud are older Londoners particularly vulnerable to?
The first one that I would mention is around pension scams. Obviously, changes with some personal pensions means you can access a proportion from the age of 55. And so people will get an email offering sort of cash benefits in return for some of their pension. And I think it's £90,000, which is the average amount lost to pension frauds. Another one is investments scams, where people receive emails, they're duped into investing into products or schemes that don't exist. I think there's some evidence that older people are more likely to be victims of sort of impersonation scams. So whether that's an official, someone pretending to be an official from HMRC, offering a tax rebate, either linking to a site or they as a way of getting that person's personal details. Romance scams has been mentioned, whether it's chat room messages, emails, social media, grooming someone to believe that they are in a genuine relationship and sending money to the fraudster, and things like increases in social isolation make that more likely. There's other ones like emails around the TV license. When the changes for people over 75 came in, that was something that increased. But there's also, holiday scams, people paying for fake holidays that don't exist, a range of phishing emails. And then there's also the range of COVID-related fraud and email scams. So that's emails asking someone to pay in return for a vaccine COVID pass or a vaccine certificate. Emails around paying money or sending you to a malicious website to process a vaccine test, or saying you've been in touch with someone with Omicron. Here's how you can get a PCR. And then I think, and this maybe started slightly earlier in the pandemic, were scam emails around how to get hand sanitizer, face masks, lateral flow tests. Also, older people are more likely to give to charities, so scam charity donation emails as well.
So are there some groups of older Londoners who would be more vulnerable to fraud than others?
Yes. So if you live alone, and half of Londoners over 75 do live alone, you are more vulnerable. You don't have that person to go, oh, this doesn't seem right, or did you receive that as well, or this is a bit strange, should I click it? And then similarly connected to that is the rise of social isolation. People are staying at home more. They are not accessing some of the support networks or having some of the conversations that would make them more aware of scams, or to check in and ask questions. People living with dementia or some form of cognitive decline are vulnerable. People that have already been scammed once, because they go onto lists and are particularly targeted on an ongoing basis. People that have suffered bereavement, of course, that sadly increased during the pandemic, and any kind of recent trauma makes you more vulnerable. Experiencing financial hardship, it might alter some of your decision-making processes because you feel really desperate and you're more vulnerable. And then if you don't have digital skills, or you've only got online in the last few months or the last few years, you don't have that experience that makes you more savvy, or you haven't been told how to what the strongest passwords are, or how to get an antivirus, or how to protect yourself. So digital skills is an important part of this.
Thank you. Can I come back to the police now, just in terms of, do you have a kind of breakdown of fraud victims by age category? Do you kind of track that? And are you, because I can imagine people could be embarrassed by being caught out by some of these frauds, and I just wonder how much of an issue underreporting is in terms of this. I wonder, would Commander Roper like to pick that one up?
Thank you very much. Thank you. So in terms of the breakdown, the demographics of our victims of fraud, absolutely. We can break that down in terms of age of victims, as you've said.
I'm sorry, can I be really rude? Can you come nearer to your microphone?
Of course. Is that better?
That's much better, thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, we use that particularly during the lockdowns to identify where our particular vulnerable communities were. We directed a significant amount of crime prevention advice to those particular communities, and also conducted thousands of victim callbacks to people who've been victims before, to try and prevent re-victimisation of people. So absolutely, we can do that breakdown, and we've deployed for crime prevention and reassurance, and to make sure that we can encourage people to come forward to report further if they are a victim again.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before we go on to Assembly Member Decide, can you tell me in the Met who holds the fraud brief? Who is in charge of fraud in the Met?
So we have the Economic Crime Command that works within my command, within the Central Specialist Crime. We also have the Cybercrime Command that works within that remit as well. But of course, we work across all of our business groups in terms of delivering our response to this type of criminality and others, of course. So ultimately, it sits within frontline policing with Assistant Commissioner Nick Fgrave. But we do work across all of the business groups to make sure that we can have the most robust response.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to our guests. I have a set of specific questions about the COVID-19 bounce back loan scheme fraud. And if I can direct my questions to the City of London Police and then to the Met as well. So if I can start off with the City of London Police Commander, to what extent are organized crime gangs or other criminal networks involved in this, in the bounce back loan scheme fraud?
Okay, so, and I hope this isn't a disappointing answer. So the remit of the police is all fraud against businesses and people. Bounce back loan fraud is what we call fraud against the exchequer, or public sector fraud. And therefore doesn't fall within the remit of the police. In fact, it falls within the remit of the National Investigation Service, which is part of BEIS, as part of government. So actually, we don't investigate bounce-back loan fraud. And indeed, during the pandemic, we had just a handful of reports that came to us in relation to bounce-back loans. But sadly not within the remit of police, and therefore unable to answer that last question, I'm afraid.
And I assume, Commander Roper, that you'll probably give me the same answer?
Absolutely, I would.
Right. Well, I did have a follow-up question, so I'll come back to you to Assistant Commissioner. And I suspect, again, you won't be able to answer my follow-up question, because I mean, this is a very serious issue. It's been reported that the government has been defrauded by something like between £4 to £5 billion. I was going to ask you about the National Investigation Service. What exactly is this body? I think you said it falls under the auspices of BEFS, business. Can you tell us more about this body? What is it?
My knowledge is limited here, but I think the National Investigation Service is almost like a task force effect that looks at different elements of public sector fraud. So, for example, you know, like tax fraud, which is normally the remit of HMRC, you have pensions fraud, traditionally the remit of the Department of Work and Pension. So my understanding is that the NIS is a task force across those different public sector agencies, proactively targeting crime that impacts the exchequer or public purse.
And it falls under which government structure? You use some business efficiency, sorry, the business...
Yeah, BEIS. I believe...
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to ask you that why is it this body and not the National Crime Agency that's leading on the work? There's so many of these structures. Are you able to shed light on why it's them and not the National Crime Agency? Or again, you...
No, I can speak about that. So the National Crime Agency's remit is quite rightly to focus on serious, organised and complex crime. And previously, the experience and the focus of the NCA was very much around serious and organised crime, such as child sexual exploitation, the importation of firearms and drugs, and a whole range of organised crime. And actually, the National Crime Agency is able to focus on the highest harm networks involved in serious and organised crime. And then it works in partnership with regional policing and local policing to prevent, disrupt and enforce against serious organised crime. In relation to fraud, the only element of the the only element aligned to the National Crime Agency that has a fraud remit is the National Economic Crime Centre. That is a system lead for fraud against people and businesses. But there is no aspect of the National Crime Agency nor police involved in fraud against the Exchequer.
Right. So my next question really, again, I was going to ask you, how are you working with the government to identify those behind the bounce back loan scheme fraud and seek recovery of funds? But presumably it's the National Investigation Service that's doing all this.
Yes, so in relation to bounce back loans, but I think more broadly, in terms of the fraud that we're discussing today, we're doing lots of great work with the National Economic Crime Centre. And what we're trying to do, with all that volume that comes into action fraud, that we react to and we try to be good around prevention and enforcement, what we're trying to do as government, as a police service with the National Economic Crime Centre, is actually to start identifying the most serious networks and people committing acts of fraud and disrupting them and taking them out before they can harm victims. And at the moment, the National Economic Crime Centre is working with the National Crime Agency to use its capabilities to do just that. But we're at the very beginning of that journey, and the National Economic Crime Centre has a strong and important leadership role in that systematic response to fraud against people and businesses. But I do recognise that the response in the UK to fraud against people and businesses is different to the UK response to fraud against exchequer fraud, like tax evasion and pension fraud. And I do think in the future there are opportunities to join those up, because actually, for all we know, the people and networks involved in tax evasion and pension fraud are also committing romance frauds and courier frauds and bank account frauds and cybercrime. So actually, yes, you're absolutely right. There needs to be better coordination and join up across that system in the long term.
So my final question then, both to you, Commander, and Assistant Commissioner, and to the Met. We are talking here about what's going on in London. Are you able to give us any figures about what the total amount of money lost through COVID loan fraud originated in London?
In relation to bounce back loans, sadly not. I can allude to some figures for fraud more general if the committee wanted that, but I can't respond to bounce back loans, I'm afraid.
Right. Presumably, Commander, I mean, you can't help us.
Once again, I echo that.
Okay, I'll leave it at that, Chair.
It's a different department, but we'll
What does that
maybe
mean?
look at that another
I may
time.
talk to you later about going through Secretariat and seeing whether we can get this information.
Yes, absolutely. Assembly Member Mayer.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, just for a bit of clarification. So that was a really helpful explanation of the separation, but the fraud around bounce back loan and so on versus the fraud that's reported to you, where is that counted? So does that count towards your numbers? Because that is still a crime, or is it counted? It's obviously investigated by Bays, as you said, but who counts it? Like, whose numbers does it add to?
It definitely does not appear in the numbers that we count across policing and nor the National Crime Agency. I'm assuming it's counted by a separate department in government.
Okay, I think there's definitely a case here for trying to join some of these dots up, don't you? But we'll come to that another time. We're now going on to a second section, which is current and future impact of online fraud. And the first questions are taken by Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. My first question is to Assistant Commissioner O'Doherty. What are the wider impacts of online fraud on London's economy and criminal activity?
Significant, and with great brevity. So first of all, the impact on the individual. So most obviously financial loss, and John did a fantastic job at explaining the impact that has, particularly on elderly and vulnerable people. You know, we've seen people at risk of suicide as a result of financial loss. And, you know, actually, to lose £2,000 to an average Londoner is an awful lot of money, be that an online holiday that doesn't exist, a fake insurance premium, a fraudulent application, a phishing scam. So first of all, financial loss, which can lead to mental health issues, and we have seen people wanting to commit suicide as a result of the fraud, and we have had to intervene and dynamically support those people. That's the first issue. The second issue is confidence. So we lead our lives on the internet, you know, whether you want to buy a car, even buy a home, send money to friends or family overseas, we live on the internet. But actually, if you are victimized through the internet and therefore are not confident to use the internet anymore, where every transaction and every company you engage with as a consumer you question, how are you supposed to live? I mean, I'm not sure in the next 5 years you'll be able to walk into an estate agent on the high street and buy a home or buy a holiday if we're going to be a completely digitized world. So that's another issue around confidence and the impact that has on you being able to live your life in the future. Then we get into impact on business. So actually, as a police service in previous years, for good reasons, when we hear about an elderly, vulnerable person being victimized, there is no greater priority. But actually, if you consider a cyber attack on a bank, or where an insurance company loses millions of pounds as a result of a cyber attack, actually, we all suffer. Because what happens is insurance premiums go up. So actually, fraud against businesses has an impact on communities as it does have on citizens. And I think the last point I would make is that, you know, other crimes, there are, when you become a detective, you get taught about the reasons why people commit crimes. We have crimes of passion, crimes of retribution, payback, all that. But actually, people commit fraud to make money. But actually, people don't make the money and then go and live a peaceful life. They make money through fraud and then use the fraud in other criminal endeavours. We know that a percentage of the networks and people involved in fraud are also involved in human trafficking, the importation of firearms. So actually, the impact through the gains of criminals actually further supports their work to harm even more victims through other crime types. And in summary, that's what I consider to be the impact from fraud.
Thank you very much. I mean, you've talked about banks. I wonder if you could perhaps tell your answer to smaller businesses in London as well, because as we know, small businesses are the backbone to local economies. How is it affecting small businesses?
And apologies, because actually that is extremely important. I should have mentioned, because a larger business is more likely to recover from a cyber attack or a loss incurred through fraud. But as we know, for small, medium enterprises, which are indeed the backbone of our economy, both now and in the future, can absolutely disrupt businesses and put them out of business, affecting families all across the country. And I think we're trying to improve the prevention advice and support we give to small, medium enterprises. And if I could give to the member just one small example. So SMEs are at risk of cyber-enabled frauds and cyber attacks. We know this. We have launched cyber resilience centres all across the country to actually work with SMEs and use students from universities who are experts in coding, network infrastructure, cyber security, and get those students who know more about cyber than the rest of us to work with those SMEs at low cost to help build robust cyber security regimes. And actually, we are very close to launching the London Cyber Resilience Centre, which will pick up of the work from the London Digital Cyber Security. And its raison d'etre is to support SMEs, not large corporates. So it is a huge issue and one that we need to focus on going forward.
Have students taken this up? Do you have a lot of take-up from students? Because it seems like a really good part-time job, actually, when you're studying.
Yeah, indeed. So it's an opportunity for students to bring their training and knowledge they're acquiring through university to actually get a job. You know how it is, we have graduates, you can't get a job without experience, you can't get experience without a job. So this is great for students, it's great for policing, one, because they bring expertise we don't have, two, we can provide services to businesses at lower cost with expertise we don't have, third of all, it's good for diversity and inclusion across policing, So many benefits. And actually, we spoke before to Chair around our recruitment challenges across policing. For me, they are a group of people that are our future and a fantastic recruitment pool to attract into policing.
Thank you. My final question is to the Met and MOPAC, and I'll let Commander Roper or DI Roch decide who takes this question on behalf of the Met. Assistant Commissioner O'Doherty was very frank, and I appreciate the candour in explaining about the issues of resourcing and how difficult that's been. So this question is with that in the background. The strategic review of policing, led by Michael Barber, is understood to highlight that public trust in the Met has fallen more steeply than any other police force, sadly. It is set to say that high-volume crimes such as fraud that go unsolved has impacted upon the drop in trust. Has any work been done to understand whether it is this lack of action to tackle fraud and other volume crimes in London, or whether it is, very sadly, about the series of scandals regarding officer standards and culture in recent years that have had a greater impact on this decline in trust? And Kenny, maybe you could start.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's a very important question. What I would say on that is, so the review came out yesterday. Yes. It definitely does say in very stark terms that in Michael Barber's view, the sort of, if the public thinks that the primary reason for the police existing is to detect and solve crime, then the fact that it's, I think it's 0.1% the review calculates of these have a positive outcome, he argues, feeds it into overall trust and confidence within police forces. Within London, we measure trust and confidence through the public attitude survey. We have done quite a lot of work to look at what sits behind that and what drives that. And we know, for example, that the strongest indicator, or the only one which is strongly linked to both trust and confidence, is around police effectiveness. Now, we want to do more work to understand exactly what police effectiveness covers, and we have been discussing that with the Strategic Insights Unit in the Met Police and with our own Evidence and Insights team. I think it would be a fair supposition to say that at its core, the level of sanction detections or positive outcomes will play into that as a whole. Would I say that fraud plays in any more strongly than other crime types into that? I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, the Strategic Review of Policing notes that only 4% of people that they surveyed actually raised fraud proactively as an issue. When we did our public consultation on the Mayor's Policing and Crime Plan, it wasn't a prevalent issue. It was obviously something which came up in the response from your own committee to all of this. So there is work being done to underpin all of this. Do I think that sanction detections plays a part? Absolutely, as it plays into police effectiveness. But I think there's still more work for us to do to really get under the skin of exactly what does drive trust and confidence and what can be done to turn it around, which I know everybody is absolutely focused on in both MOPAC and in the Met.
Thank you. And of our two Met representatives, who would like, or both?
Thank you. I'll go first, if I may. So, echoing that point in terms of understanding what is really driving the understanding of trust and confidence in London is clearly very important, and my MOPAC colleague has already expressed that. In terms of the Met's reflection with regards to trust and confidence of our communities, clearly it's crucial. Clearly we absolutely understand the current operating environment that we have for that. You've reflected on some particular instances specifically over the last 12 months, and we're working extremely hard to work with our communities to understand exactly the service that they are wanting from us and that they absolutely deserve. With regards to fraud, particularly in online activity, I think that it is fair to say that we don't exactly know how that's playing out in terms of those trust and confidence figures. The Metropolitan Police, led by the Commissioner, has been very clear that our priority has been violence, and violence has been coming down year upon year, and that continues to be our focus. But we do still dedicate resources to fraud and to online criminality, and that will be continuing. We operate through, as I've already mentioned, dedicated teams, dedicated commands for that type of criminality, and we diffuse our skills and our support to communities and to victims through our frontline policing units, our BCUs, our command units. So your question is how much is it having the influence? I don't think we know. Is it important that we make sure that we work with our communities to protect them from this type of criminality, to reinforce the activity that we're doing, that we work with the City of London and all of other partners to make sure that we can disrupt and frustrate this type of criminal behaviour, then that's clearly where we're focusing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Morning, everyone. If I could start, I think you maybe have touched on this before, but if I could start with Age UK, just thinking about, you gave the description earlier of the impact of this type of crime, particularly on older people. From your point of view, how does the response that victims see, or the victims that you see, how does the response that they get from policing sort of match either your expectation or your hope, or their expectation or hope of what the response ought to be?
The response people are receiving is not something I know a lot about. The Age UK different information and advice phone lines and teams will know more. I guess the level of response obviously needs to be adequate for the impact on the victim, and the financial impact can be so devastating because these are people's life savings that they might have been saving up for making their home more accessible, for some social care costs, for health costs. And then, if we think about the impact on someone's health and well-being, you're 2.4 more times likely to go into a care home. If you've been a victim of fraud, you are more likely to require social care support that you wouldn't otherwise need. It's more likely to exacerbate things like social isolation. And it's also more likely to stop you from going on the internet at all. And bearing in mind there's so much support, whether it's council tax discounts with application processes that are pretty much online only, you're missing out on a lot of support. So I guess I don't know enough about the response, but in terms of it needs to be adequate for the impact, which is really, really profound.
Yeah, I think we're hearing that loud and clear about the impact, particularly all the people who have life savings sort of cleaned out. In terms of moving on, sorry, still to Age UK, thinking, obviously we've spoken a bit about the London level, in terms of what the government might do, or things that the government would need to lead at the national level, is there anything there that you think that you'd be asking for, or that you think needs doing?
So colleagues at the National Age UK charity have been working with the government on the online safety bill. I know that there was a recent gap where there were concerns about fraud through paid-for advertising on the internet that might not have been included within the scope of the bill. So I guess my sort of recommendations would be more for what the mayor could perhaps do.
Okay. So taking that last question, I'm going to move along. So if I ask from the City of London Police, in terms of what you would look for in terms of national legislation or government action, what's missing there, or what would you like to see there?
Apology, in relation to the improved response to victims?
Sorry, no, in terms of, in terms of tackling the whole problem. Sorry, I moved, so there was a question about victims, but then about what do we do to stop the problem? What, in your view, is what could government do in terms of legislation, national framework, and so on, to help you get a grip?
Okay. I think there are a few things. So there's a lot of legislation coming into effect, which is going to make a huge difference. So online safety bill, we have the economic crime bill, which is going to be or provide a much more robust framework for overseas businesses to effectively do business here in the UK, which is going to make a huge difference. The pressure on social media companies via the online safety bill is going to make a big difference. So much of our crimes we have are driven by social media and online search engines. I also think the economic crime levy, which puts a fee to large financial institutions where turnover is over £10 million, that's going to help us not in the fraud space, but build more financial investigators across police. And so I think the legislation piece is huge, and I think our relationship with industry is really important. I sometimes can't believe it when you go on something like Facebook Marketplace, and my view is, I mean, a lot of the goods being sold are counterfeit goods, and you think, how is that allowed? And actually, you know, how people are able to have an account on social media, supply products and engage with future victims, that needs a huge tightening up in terms of legislation and regulation. And I think for us, yeah, in terms of what we should be doing nationally from a legislation point of view, that's where I would be focused on.
In terms of industry, which you obviously mentioned then,
yeah.
I don't know whether you're being diplomatic. Benefit where I am, I don't have to be diplomatic. My background is in IT. I've worked in a situation where we've had enormous contracts with telcos, and even then they are incredibly useless at actually doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing or reacting to things that aren't the thing that they want to be doing. And so when you look at this kind of crime area, it seems to me that there's an enormous amount that they could be doing to make the villains' lives more difficult. Is that something that is probably going to require legislation to compel them to do that, to give them a duty to assist? Or are they just, maybe I'm being unfair, are they being, you know, falling over themselves to be incredibly helpful? Phone companies, you know, online social media companies, ISPs, those kinds of companies.
Yeah, I think so. We've had mixed experience. On one hand, we do have a very good relationship with telcos in that a lot of the cyber enablers used in fraud, like telephone, VoIP platforms, bank accounts, we work with partners, telcos being one, to disrupt those enablers to prevent future victimization. But even though that's good work, it's short-termism and doesn't have a long-term impact. And what we would like to see is a much more robust process for people to have phone numbers, to have social media accounts, and to have a proper verification process through better identity checks, bank account checks, and a robust approach to the vetting of those applications, and that will hugely reduce fraud at the front end. And, you know, one example, the Treasury Select Committee report into economic crime recently spoke about reform to Companies House, and actually improving the process, higher fees, much better verification process if you want to be a business. And actually, I think that's really good for us, and we can apply that across the telco system, social media companies, and further afield across industry.
So who's leading on that work? Is that government that's leading on that, or you, or is it a collaborative thing?
At the moment, only the kind of the recommendations exist in a strategic review and report. We're yet to see what the specific actions are, who's going to own them and who's going to deliver them. But I would suggest the first step in that process is legislative reform.
And is the online safety bill, which you mentioned, is that doing anything to support any of this kind of work?
Indeed. In the economic crime report, mentions the online safety bill, which is its vehicle for changes to regulation and legislation for that very issue.
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether on that point about the sort of what's going on nationally and what government could do to support your work. I don't know whether the Met, sorry, I can't really see you, we've got this weird rectangular table. I don't know whether anyone from the Met or MOPAC wanted to add to what we've just heard.
Yes, John Roch. I'd just echo everything that Mr. Doherty said, and I made mention earlier of the need for a whole system approach. Because of the nature of online fraud and the plethora of providers that facilitate, wittingly or unwittingly, the frauds to take place, we do need that cross-party approach, government, law enforcement, and those service providers. And whether that's through a moral or social responsibility or a legal liability, that's definitely what's required. And you're quite right, the Online Safety Bill does make reference to some provisions for fraud now, and that I would suggest is the strongest vehicle we could use to start to get the compliance in that sector. We see a large number of our frauds will start from a click on a link on whether it's social media or a fake web page or something similar. All are being hosted by companies that are making profit.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I won't add to what Peter or John has said there, other than to agree, but what I would say is I think when you look at legislation, our request of the government would be that in the same way that the government has looked at the drugs issue and recognised it's a really big cross-societal issue which requires a long-term response, and they've come out with a 10-year drug strategy. I think something similar for fraud, like legislation might be one part of it, but for example, there are no, although it's the biggest crime type, you look at the statistics that the government produces on this, they're still at the experimental stage, they're produced annually rather than quarterly. They don't break down by force type. The counting rules which the Home Office uses for this, and I'm sure my operational colleagues can go into far more detail, just aren't fit for purpose. There's just a dearth of research into what really is the genuine problem here, what works, what are the vulnerabilities. The College of Policing needs to do more to evaluate the preventative measures and really disseminate best practice across the piece. So I think looking at things in isolation, yes, we need to do that, and obviously some things will need to be tactical and done in a short term, but I do think this is such a big issue, and if you look at the trend data in reports, it's only going to go like that, isn't it? I do think this is one of the issues, like the government has done with drugs, to be fair, where they do need to, rather than, they will have a 3-year strategy coming out, 22 to 25, but I'd like to see that complemented by a much longer term issue where actually we look at where we want to be over the next 10, 20 years rather than just in 2 or 3.
Yeah, in terms of statistics, I think that's quite useful because it's hard to see if you're doing a better job if you don't really measure accurately what the situation is. Do you think the statistics issue, is that because it's a new, in inverted commas, crime type, or is it the fact that it's a rapidly evolved crime type or an invisible crime type, or is it because it has such a cross-jurisdictional issue? I don't know whether that's... Lots of
I think actually you've answered your question very well. Cross-jurisdictional, evolving rapidly, and a rapidly changing landscape for us.
Sure.
But just say one thing that I forgot to say, which was, yes, legislation, regulation, partnership working, and we recognise that for the big social media companies, they're in this narrative around data privacy and protecting their members and consumers, but equally, how do we prevent crime? But I think we need a cultural shift. We speak a lot about corporate social responsibility. This is more than that. One could argue that if you are a social media company that is knowingly allowing business to happen, that is the commission of crime, you could argue that you are knowingly enabling the commission of crime, which actually is a criminal offence. So I would just say I think we might need a cultural pivot on this discussion because the time has come. It's just so prominent for fraud to stem from social media and other online companies. Is it time to finish the discussion around corporate social responsibility and have a more robust debate with companies?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. I think there's a tendency to see the online world as a very sort of new and innovative and everything. You know, it's a sort of two guys operating out of their garage, and actually these are enormous multi-billion-pound companies who can well afford to spend a chunk of their cash, avoiding their users, which probably includes all of us in this room, from being victimized. Had another question. So we've spoken a bit about the national stuff. If I could come down to the London area. I know, I think many of us on this committee were disappointed when the mayor said, and I think the deputy mayor's reiterated, that fraud isn't the priority. And I understand, he reiterates that violent crime is his priority. I think, listening to the discussion today, it's hard to say that, what does the word priority mean? I think it's fair to say that violent crime would always be the Met's priority. But does this crime type get anything like enough resources within the Met to deal with the issues that victims in London are seeing?
Thank you very much. So whilst our priority within the Met, and we've reflected in terms of the police and crime plan, it's clear the priority is violence. Absolutely, we dedicate resources to this crime type, and I've already described the different departments, the different commands that we already have. We have over 300 officers dedicated to economic crime, working to my colleague John. We also have approximately 100 officers working on cybercrime, but they work collaboratively, both in terms of the investigatory capability, the work that they do in the protect and the crime prevention space. Crucially, however, it is not just that group of people who are investigating the most technical and the most complex criminality in this space. It's not just those people that are looking at this across the organisation. I've mentioned that we work within frontline policing to our Assistant Commissioner Nick Fgrave, but also he is responsible for all of our frontline policing assets across all of the BCUs across London. We have training and development given to our frontline officers. We've already referred to some of the inputs that they get during their probationary period. We have cybercrime champions that operate across all parts of London to make sure that if people are investigating a particular type of crime and they need advice and guidance, then there's someone immediately available. And we also offer an on-call response from the specialist crime side that I'm responsible for. We have different types of responses available, and particularly a call to service, where if some of our banks and financial institutions feel that there is something happening exactly in front of them and there is somebody immediately vulnerable, then there is a protocol that is well established across our partners in order for us to get down there as soon as possible and to protect our most vulnerable. In terms of the protect and the crime prevention space, we work again across all of the directorates within the organisation to offer crime prevention advice. We work particularly with our London Safety Centre, who is our lead within the Metropolitan Police Service for crime prevention, to support the national campaigns and the awareness campaigns that are often led by the City of London and our colleagues, but also specifically deliver the Little Book of Scams online and physically to make sure we can reach the most vulnerable. I've talked a little bit about the victim callbacks that we particularly identified as important during lockdown to identify those most vulnerable. So there's a huge amount of work happening, and so yes, I would say that the resource is appropriate, and what I do also think, however, is we need to really push that protect and crime prevention activity, and I think we've had a discussion across the panel about how looking at across industry, looking across our partners, our social media platforms, how there's more that we can do there.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, I think we'd all agree that it's better to prevent a crime occurring than to detect and sanction after it's happened. In terms of the resource, how's that changed over the last few years? That, you know, the Met resource that's focusing on this.
So during the restructure of the Metropolitan Police Service, in terms of actual numbers, we merged certain functions to make sure that we were creating greater efficiencies, and we were actually bringing crime types closer together. So as I say, within my directorate, or with my area of responsibility, we have these two dedicated teams. So numerically, the actual officers allocated to those teams have slightly reduced. However, the efficiency and the mutual support of those teams has greatly increased.
Okay, and then, so final question on Met resource. So we're going through a period now of uplift of police officers. We have a significant number of new officers being recruited, and I don't like to predict the future too much, but I think that probably is not going to continue at the current pace indefinitely. So going back to the conversation earlier about the fact that this is a different kind of policing from sort of standard beat policing, needs a different kind of skill. What's the Met doing to make sure that during this sort of opportunity to where lots of extra officers are coming in, to make sure that we're getting at least some chunk of officers who have those kinds of skills, who may not be the kind of skills that traditionally police forces would recruit?
So in terms, we've talked about the structures, and then we talked about the response by the Metropolitan Police is diffused across all of our business groups, and I think that that's where we need to focus. We are looking at increasing town centre teams. We're looking at increasing the visibility of our policing uplift to make sure that we are able to reach our communities in the most visible way. Part of this, though, is the skill set that we've already discussed in terms of the training they receive. So this is about making sure that people know how to respond, our officers know how to respond, we know how to do that crime prevention advice, and we know how to do that victim care when somebody's a victim of this crime. I don't think it's as easy as dedicating particular additional officers to either parts of my command. I think it's making sure that we increase the capacity and capability capability across the organisation. And with the training that they're given, with the crime prevention advice that they are putting to our communities, to that real community focus and that victim focus of our new probationers that are coming through, I think that's where we'll have an increase in the effectiveness of our policing of this area.
I think, though, it's a bit disappointing. I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is recruiting people and then trying to train them in these skills. And I would say, as someone who has a background in this, there is a difference between, a general purpose police officer who then gets some specific training in this versus saying, okay, we've got thousands of extra officers over a period of years. Let's try and recruit, 30, 50 officers who have a different kind of background. Maybe they have a computer science background, who actually really understand this. They're not the people who need training on it. They're the people who would then be training other people and really stiffening what's going on. That isn't something that you've done. Or is it still something that could be done? I'm just conscious that uplift is not going to go on forever. Let's not miss that opportunity to capture some new people.
So there's already been a reflection by my colleagues in terms of the training and the input that our officers get already within their probationary period and throughout their training in terms of economic criminality and the type of work that we're discussing here. In terms of recruiting specific skill sets, I think I'd like to refer to my colleague's reference to the systems-based approach, that actually what we want to do, and we've made it clear that within the Metropolitan Police Service, our focus is on violence, that visibility, that reassurance work, that work on trust and confidence, which doesn't in any way take away from the impact of the type of criminality we're discussing this morning, but we think that we can do it better and more effectively to help protect and prevent crime within our communities. But I think, as John alluded to, this is about that systems-based approach, and if we can pull on all the different levers with regards to industry, we talked about legislation, priorities, corporate social responsibility, that's actually where we can have the greatest impact.
Okay, I'll leave that there. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I do have sympathy with comments made from Assembly Member Garrett, because it is a specialist, and given its volume crime, nobody disputes that we have to look at violent crime, but it's volume crime. And I think Assembly Member May mentioned confidence and trust in the police, and all these little crimes bite away at that confidence. So I agree with both my colleagues, and I definitely hope going forward we can look into that. Assistant Commissioner.
Thank you. I thought I'd respond from a national perspective. So I think, first of all, yes, there is a proportion of fraud that's specialist. We've got crypto involved. We've got elements of crime networks in different countries. We accept that. But actually, there is a big proportion of fraud that I don't think we can call specialist anymore. Maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. But if you look at a simple fraud like a online auction fraud, where you buy a product from Gumtree or Facebook and you never get the product and they take your money, or you get contacted by an investment scam artist on a UK phone number, that is not complex fraud anymore. And actually, any generic police detective does have the skills to investigate those high volume, less complex frauds, is the first point. So actually, we need a position in policing, as I said before, where every frontline cop is able to investigate that lower level fraud. The second point around recruitment is we do need to absolutely agree with the member, Neil Garrett, around diversifying recruitment. So if I could just say, under the work we're doing to build those 20 20 investigators across the 9 regions in England and Wales, we're working, or will be working, with different companies like Police Now, for example, to approach universities for students working in studying cybersecurity or studying coding or economic crime, to actually attract them into policing on a direct entry fraud detective scheme. So people who have a specific interest around fraud or cyber, digital natives, getting them into policing, because the reality is that there is competition within policing between local policing and counter-terrorism policing and the regional organised crime units. We're all fishing from the same pools. And actually, for the specialist element of fraud, as Catherine rightly alluded to, we do need a specific new type cohort of people coming into policing to work in this field. And that is work underway at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank
Thank you very much. This is proving to be a very interesting discussion this morning, and I think that point is exactly right. You've got to diversify some of your specialist officers here. I'm just picking up from the questions before. Commander Roper, what is the establishment for your 2 teams dedicated to this work?
Thank you. We have over 300 posts dedicated within the Economic Crime Unit, working to John, and we have approximately 100 posts working to the Cyber Crime Unit. 21 of those are dedicated to looking at crime prevention and the protect work.
Okay, so over 400, and have you got a high vacancy rate, or are they pretty much filled?
Sorry, just checking with John. So we have approximately a 20% vacancy rate at the moment. But what I would like to sort of echo again from my previous points is that the response, these are not the sole resources within the Metropolitan Police Service that are responding to this type of criminality. We diffuse it across all of the business groups.
I've heard that, but often we see teams and you hear what the establishment is, and the reality on the ground is that you're 20% is pretty high vacancy rate. Okay, that's really useful to hear. I want to let's pick up prevention first. We've started moving into that area. And I know the director of the Police Foundation has raised concerns that the government's Beating Crime plan, launched last year, puts much too much emphasis on enforcement, which is where we focused so far this morning, rather than prevention in relation to fraud, cybercrime and so on. So what are you doing to ensure there's much more of a focus on prevention? You said you've got 21 officers dedicated to that. So let's start with the Met and with you, Commander. What are you doing to prevent this crime taking place in the first place?
Thank you. So we do work with the City of London Police, of course, as the force lead in this area, but also other partners in terms of those awareness campaigns that we've previously spoken about. Clearly, that includes our financial institution partners, the banks and the post offices. And I'm sure that we've all seen some of those online fraud campaigns and awareness campaigns circulate to all of us. In addition to that, we are working with various community groups to increase local community awareness across all demographics, actually, including a dedicated and a bespoke community watch project where we're delivering across various across London crime prevention advice. We've also had the online sharing through our websites and through community groups of the book of scams that we also have been physically delivering in the tens of thousands over the last couple of years to get some of that crime prevention advice both online and also in a physical form. We have initiated the victim callbacks, where we're identifying people who've been a victim of fraud previously and calling them back to talk about specific crime prevention awareness that we can give them to prevent them becoming a victim again. And certainly when we were doing that during the COVID period, we identified some people who had been victims of fraud again, and we were able to provide them with the right advice and guidance to report. We also identified people that, going back to my colleague from Age UK, who were particularly vulnerable and who needed additional welfare support, and we were able to refer them into the correct agencies. I'd just like to come back to the comment with regards to the our smaller enterprises. With MOPAC funded over the last 2 years specific training, advice and guidance, working with our, I'll just get I always use an acronym, so I just want to check the Police Crime the Police Crime Prevention Initiatives. I always use an acronym, and I just wanted to make sure I got the acronym correctly, to make sure that we gave advice and guidance to small businesses directly. This was initially meant to be face-to-face, but of course during COVID that couldn't happen, so they diversified very quickly to a whole series of online engagements and seminars to make sure that we could give advice to people. We're also looking at working with the two strands of my commands, the economic and the cybercrime command. We're also looking at going to specific areas that we've also identified vulnerability, and to make sure that we do much more in that education space. And at the risk of sounding slightly ironic in that sentence, we're actually working with schools at the moment, giving them advice and guidance as to how to make sure that their own systems can be protected as possible, working with teachers and head teachers to look at how we can best protect them and prepare them for crime prevention issues, and also working with students as well. So it's a real collection of crime prevention activities that we've got across all of the business groups.
Do you have a list of the community groups that you're working with that you could share with us?
I don't have it with me, but I certainly can provide you with a list of that outside of here.
See the breadth of that. And I'm interested, you say you're working with schools, because I know there have been attacks on some academy chains and so on, cyber attacks and so on, so that's welcome. But are your Safer Schools officers raising awareness of this with students?
So in terms of the latest campaign, we are working with the Central Schools Unit within the Metropolitan Police Service to make sure that they are repeating the messages of my specialist teams that are going out and working with the schools. And of course, schools officers are always working with young people to talk about the vulnerabilities of increased online presence, not just about the type of fraud or cyber-enabled criminality that we're talking about today, but also other vulnerabilities that could happen. So yes is the short answer, but of course they do it in different ways, depending on the focus of those conversations.
Okay, Ken, is there anything you want to add from MOPAC's point of view on this point of prevention?
Yeah, thank you. So first, Commander Roper stole what I was going to talk about the digitally aware work on the London crime prevention initiatives. I would highlight two, well, just that first of all, we have, and actually I think John was at this meeting, we had a meeting last week to look at how we can get messages out more clearly. We started by looking at elderly people. I think that had Met, it had City of London Police, it had Age UK Victim Support, to look at how we in City Hall can look at the materials and actually we can see how we can expand that out. And we've also been having some initial discussions with National Trading Standards about some of the work that they have and how that can perhaps get pushed out. And I think there's a follow-up meeting which is coming with the Met and City of London Police in the next few weeks on that. I would also highlight, as Assistant Commissioner Doherty said earlier, about the London Cyber Resilience Centre, which is something which we are obviously in MOPAC at the forefront of, and I think technically will be the owner of it. And then I would say, although this isn't directly related to the prevention side of it, we are very much in MOPAC at the moment looking at, as part of the response to the police and crime plan consultation, in particular in response to what the PCC has said about what sort of meaningful metric there might be at a top level to look at fraud. Now, that is, just by the very nature of the way this works, actually proving really, really difficult to come up with something because of the way that fraud is different, because it gets reported in tax and fraud, gets disseminated out via NFIB, and then the way you actually look at detections or judicial outcomes isn't reported in quite the same way as other crimes, and counting rules, as I've said, aren't quite the same. But just that is something, because I think it was Assemblymember Garrett said that we aren't treating it as a priority, just to say that will be, it is a measure where we're hoping it will be in the final plan if we can come up with something meaningful. I'd rather, if it wasn't though, that we said we're still working on it, than come up with something which is half-baked, if I can be honest, because it is quite difficult. Another force does it, and I suspect for the very good reason that once you look at it, your head sort of explodes. But we are looking at all of that, and I hope that will be a signal of the priority.
If I'd start then with the Met and move over to the city for a wider perspective, but in terms of specific online fraud awareness campaigns, you've touched on this a couple of times. Can you give us some examples of those campaigns and how you've measured success?
Sorry, so I'd like to repeat again that one of our major campaigns was around the Little Book of Scams that we really pushed out, working collaboratively with the City of London Police and with our other partners within this area. And then very much more, as I was saying, was working with the other community groups. And there have been a number of other campaigns that I might just ask John to remind me of in a second over the last few years in terms of those awareness and working with businesses and also with communities. And John, can you just remind me of some of the other campaigns?
So I think one of the important things that we haven't touched on that covers this subject very well is the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit, that's now the National Economic Crime Victim Care Unit, that offers varying levels of service and care and protect and prevent advice to victims across London and now across a wider network. And I can speak about this very positively because we have a fantastic relationship with the city, and I think it's a very successful initiative. But I'm very much aware it's owned by the city. And I should probably ask Mr. Doherty to speak about that, but I have nothing but good things to say about this, and I hope you'll be glad to hear some of the words he can offer.
Okay, did you want to just finish off there on other campaigns specifically before we move on to that?
So the majority of our campaigns are linked to the same online advice and assets that are contained within the Economic Victim Care Unit option. So I'll touch on it. I'll let Mr. Doherty. There are a number of different gradings of vulnerability of a victim, and that will also depend upon victims' wishes as to how they wish to be treated. But contained within those different thresholds are different levels of campaign that we offer to the victim, and they are a number of click options that describe varying types of protect activity that they can undertake themselves, and they're encouraged to share those with obviously other friends. But most of it sits within the economic crime victim care package. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. I think when I'm talking about campaigns, I'm talking about fraud awareness campaigns, and you're sounding quite processy on how you deal with victims. So I'm not sure whether we're cross wires here. Kenny wants to come in, and then I'll bring the Assistant Commissioner.
Yeah, so all I was going to say is I think this goes back to what I was mentioning a little bit earlier about there isn't as much evaluation as there could be about what works. Now, I don't personally think that this is something which should be looked at a London-specific or a West Midlands-specific level. I think this needs proper research either from the Home Office or City of London and the college, which takes these things, looks at actually what does work, what is international best practice, and then gives that out to the territorial forces. Because, and this is why I sort of harp on about this, about the fact that I think it needs a long-term strategy, because you need to actually think about, well, how are we going to try out different ways of doing this? How are we going to evaluate this? What is the theory of change which underpins all of this? And at the moment, I think there's a lot of good initiatives out there, but if you were to say, I suspect to any of us around this table, hand on heart, can we say measurably what is that doing? I think we would have to, in all honesty, say no to you. I mean, I may be doing a disservice, but that has to be the right way. When you look at the scale of the fraud, this isn't, to use a cliche, something you can police your way out of. It's something that you are going to have to protect and prevent from. And I think that's why it needs to be long-term, why evaluation needs to be built in at the start, and why there needs to be an actual way for understanding what works, disseminating that, and then making sure it's tailored to whatever your local thing is, but that the core of that actually works. I don't think we have that yet.
Assistant Commissioner.
Member, can I speak about some of the campaigns we're doing and some of the tangible prevention work we lead on? And John, Catherine and Kenny are right in that as lead force across policing, we need to coordinate that prevention activity. So first of all, campaigns. We have an annual campaign calendar that looks at events that trigger fraud. So for example, in September, when people join uni, we know rental fraud is rife. We know that at the festival period during summer, like V Festival, or I'm getting a bit old to know about all of those, we know that ticket fraud is rife. We know that when Ramadan happens, Hajj fraud is rife. So we actually coordinate across policing against various campaigns. So one of our best campaigns, which we do with the Met and others, is the 12 Frauds of Christmas campaign. So in the 12 frauds up to Christmas, we look at what are the most common frauds that are going to impact people. So the romance fraud, people get lonely during holiday season, online shopping fraud, credit card fraud. And that involves sending out communication messaging through a protect network. So we have prevention officers all across the country that sends out that information consistently to businesses and members of the community. The second bit is front-end advice. So when you report action fraud and sadly you've already been a victim, the call handler just doesn't take your crime report. They work with the victim to try and capture learning for future prevention. But as John rightly said, our Economic Crime Victim Care Unit, we, on average, every quarter, we're in contact with over 7,000 victims, giving them tailored prevention advice, and particularly vulnerable victims. And that is a phone call from a dedicated crime prevention officer working with them, and we need to make that available across policing. Industry, as a member Garrett mentioned before, we have had the last 5 years Microsoft sat in our department. And what Microsoft does is it looks at computer service software fraud, which is mostly committed by Indian contact centres. And what Microsoft does is they look at how that crime is being committed, take the learning back to Microsoft, so when they release updates to their firmware, hardware, software, they build that security prevention in to their work. Lastly, we used to have a team that actually went and spoke to criminals in prison. So we actually went to criminals and said, how did you do it? And now you might say to me, why on earth would criminals speak to the police? 2 reasons. 1, they're quite lonely individuals, and 2, they love to show off. Absolutely. Now, we don't have the same powers in the US to consider early sentence release, but we can put a good behaviour report into the warden of the prison. One juicy story, years ago, a fraudster, a very young man, he designed a fraud to attack PBX infrastructure. Now, PBX was like an IP-based telephony system. Member Garrett will know much more than I do. And effectively, by learning how the criminal committed his fraud, we worked with the telecom industry to actually prevent that ever happening again. So we try to be proactive in that regard. Another one, disruption of advertising. Advertising is a big problem. We've spoken about the online safety bill. There is a new crime emerging, and that is some advertising on some dodgy websites infected with malware breaches your smart device and uses the processing power of your smart device to data mine for cryptocurrency and blockchain. So a criminal will attack 1,000 smart devices, use all of your power to effectively data mine and earn Bitcoin. So actually what we do is we have a police intellectual property crime unit who works across the UK ecosystem to take out advertising so money can't be generated. And we've got a great relationship with the advertisers in that regard. And just lastly, days of action. So we look at various crimes like courier fraud, romance scams, and with the Met and other police forces, we say, right, on this day, date and time, we're going to identify the most serious networks and people involved in courier fraud, and we're going to go and disrupt them. And that will include not just knocking on doors and arresting people, but prevention material. You know, I've been on various local, regional, national media stations, Sky, you know, I've been on Moneybox before trying to raise awareness. And I promise you, if I could just finish, impact and reach. Reach is a problem. The day before I started my job, my mum was a victim of a WhatsApp fraud. So she gets a text message from someone saying, hi, it's me, you know, I've lost my phone, keep this number. My mum says, well, who is this? A fraudster says, who do you think it is? The fraudster knows by looking at the profile picture of my mum, the chances are she's got kids. So my mum says, is it Peter, her youngest son, me? Fraudster says, yes, it's Peter. And he says, listen, Mum, my Apple Pay isn't working, new phone and all that, send me £2,000. So I get a phone call from an angry father saying, Pete, what the hell are you doing? Where's the information that you said you'd give us so we can make the transaction? And I said, hang on, Dad. 1, what son do you think you're speaking to? Because I've got 2 brothers. He said, yeah, I'm speaking to Peter. And I said, second of all, what conversation do you think we've had? Anyway, so he tells me, long story short, he doesn't make the transfer. But most people, my dad's quite controlling, and he always wants to know everything. But for most people, they wouldn't have phoned their son to ask that question. How do we reach those people in the thousands? That's our big challenge. And just lastly, as Kenny said, measuring impact. We can tell you all day long how many alerts we send out, how many campaigns we do. But I can't tell you very well, sadly, the impact we have. We are doing some work to measure this, and I'll just give you one last example to measure impact of prevention, and it requires scientific thinking. So all those telephones and websites and bank accounts that we take out by working with partners, what we're trying to do is work with industry to say, what's the future value of monetary harm prevented by taking out those entities, and how does that reduce fraud victimization at the front end? So that's the work we're doing, but we need to understand impact. And for every business, every SME, every person we speak to, as a result of our campaign work and prevention messaging, what are they going to do that's different? Because the reality is, I've always firmly believed that a lot of fraud can be prevented. So reach and measuring impact are 2 significant ambitions for us going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's really important. There's very good examples that how do you get the message out to the ordinary person? And I think around specific occasions, whether it's Christmas or whatever, I think you're quite right on that. Just to be extra careful and make sure they're aware. But also, if they are a victim, how do you know where to go? How would you know what to do? Most people might contact, I know, the phone company or whoever that you've had a phone from, send it back. They wouldn't think to report it. So your data is so tip of the iceberg, I think. So I think getting that advice out, and also advice out to elected members to advise people as well, would be really useful. You've mentioned, it's come up twice this morning, this issue of cryptocurrency. And I think Action Fraud said that over 146 million was lost to cryptocurrency fraud last year, third more than the year before. So what work are you doing nationally, and whether there's anything specifically in the Met to tackle and prevent this kind of fraud relating to cryptocurrency in the capital?
Again, forgive me, I'll speak more generally before more London-focused view. But actually, I don't think what we would be doing in London is any different. So the policing response to crypto is actually led not within the fraud portfolio, the national cybercrime portfolio that I also coordinate on. We've done lots of work to improve capability across policing to investigate crime involving cryptocurrency. You'll appreciate I can't speak about tactics because some of it is quite new. But what I would say is that we are developing confidence and capability enabled to take a case involving the use of cryptocurrency and investigate as we would if it was cash. So that's the first thing we're doing. The second thing is, for every police officer on the street that goes into a house on a warrant to recover property, is trying to educate them what to look out for. So you're not looking for credit cards in a pedestal by the bed. You're not looking for cash under the mattress. You're looking for digital forensics on their machine. How do you find crypto wallets? And the last thing we're doing is, under the Proceeds of Crime Act, we are able now, when we recover assets from criminals, and that asset is in the guise of cryptocurrencies, we are now able, with the court system, to recover the asset under POCA and ultimately convert it into cash, where some of it goes back to victims, some potentially to the police or Crown Prosecution Service. Still work to be done, and the challenge will be the pace at which this is being developed. You know now that some companies accept crypto for buying holidays. We have Bitcoin ATMs. It's a whole new world, but actually I think policing is in a good place, but more to do.
Does the Met want to add anything?
Yes, I'd say firstly we absolutely recognise the size of the potential challenge that crypto currencies face. All of our financial investigators already have a level of cryptocurrency training. However, because that landscape changes so quick, we find that to keep them up to date is actually a challenge in itself. And as soon as those that are using cryptocurrency for illicit means understand that we've achieved a certain methodology, they move on, as you would expect in any fraud type. Our conversations are ongoing around how our capability and capacity looks with cryptocurrency. And we've actually been a part of the Home Office working group looking to change some of the legislation to make it far easier for us to seize cryptocurrency in a number of different scenarios. So we very much recognise the size of the challenge, but as Mr. Doherty says, we can't really go into the methodologies in great detail.
But this emerging trends in this area of fraud is significant. How are you able to keep up? I mean, you must be having to refresh the skill sets and technological know-hows of your teams. Assistant Commissioner.
So I'll give my view, then I think John may have some more information. So I think it's hard. I have a person dedicated full-time to horizon scanning, looking at how cryptocurrencies are being used in crime. It's so hard though, because every coin works differently. So it's all on the premise of decentralization, but actually every coin works differently. It's really hard. So do we need to put more resource into it? Absolutely. More work to be done. I'm not sure what else I can say in that regard. What I would say is younger people coming into the police understand this world more than those leading those young people. So that kind of cultural transformation in policing is needed, where actually senior person doesn't always know the best. So that whole reverse mentoring piece we're doing so that senior leaders are more educated in this and can make those effective decisions. One last point is, one of the biggest issues with crypto is unregulated, as we know. And the Treasury Select Committee reporting to economic crime published 4 weeks ago, they're actually looking at bringing better or trying to regulate the cryptocurrency market like the cash market. And actually, we massively welcome that because that will give us more tools and techniques to disrupt, prevent, and ultimately enforce this world.
Lovely, thank you. John, did you want to add on that?
Yes, I think the original part of your question was related to the training aspect and how do we keep up to date. So we have very strong links with industry, and there's a growing industry around the legitimate use as well as the illicit use of cryptocurrency. So we have fantastic reach into that industry, and we are constantly revisiting our strategies with that industry. I'd also just echo what Mr. Doherty said around the Treasury Committee paper on economic crime and the possibility of just moving the boundaries around the regulation of it, because we find the fact that it is not regulated means there's a varying playing field. We do get some fantastic assistance from some of the companies operating in that area and less from others.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you. And then can I just bring it back to MOPAC and the London Victim and Witness Service, which provides help to victims of online fraud. Can you outline a bit about that for us, and how does it add value?
So, in general terms, they will get in touch with the people who decide to opt in. So first, there's 2 stages to the process. First of all, when it goes into action fraud, what will happen is that it's an opt-out process at that stage, so people are automatically referred into the LVWS and they will get in touch with people. We find the uptake there of the service is actually lower than in the normal thing, so it's only about 10% at that stage compared to about 25%. A lot of that, when you look at, for example, the work that Vera Baird did as the Victims Commissioner, things like that, is a lot of the people just don't see or consider fraud as a crime in quite the same way, or the people who tend to be affected by it, despite the fact it may have a bigger impact on older people, are younger people who just go, "Mwah, it's this money or it's that," and sort of move on. But they will be given. Then at a second stage, when it gets disseminated out to the Metropolitan Police and they take it on, they'll be then contacted within 7 days by the Metropolitan Police and again have a chance to come in, and they'll get the full care and attention which everybody will get going through that service. And obviously for the particularly vulnerable victims, as has already been mentioned, and the Home Office is now going to provide the funding for this Understand to uplift it to level 2 within London after MOPAC paid for the initial pilot. There is the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit, which provides the additional support which has already been talked about.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Duval. No, you've finished. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. I just want to dig in just a little bit more on the issue of the difficulty of measuring impact. I actually found out about that WhatsApp. This is, hey mum, can you transfer me some money? And I've received that WhatsApp message. I'd heard about it presumably through the kind of campaigning that you've done, and so I was able to just block the caller and prevent them from coming through to me again. So that messaging around that particular WhatsApp scam has cut through. But I just wonder if there is any value in focusing in on some of the particular victim groups. So I'm thinking in particular about older people, the people who are digitally excluded, and whether in terms of being able to measure impact in particular, whether actually focusing in on those groups and running some particular campaigns for older people, because I think that there is a kind of when you get a scam by email, you can check the actual email address that it's come from, and so it's quite easy to double check. When you get a scam that comes through onto your phone, which is we're all increasingly dependent on these devices that are, like a massive, great big desktop computer in only 20 years ago, and it's really impossible to check the number that something has come through from. There's no way of telling, is this a good number or a bad number? I get text messages all the time that seem to be from a bank, and then you realize, no, actually it's not. And it's, so I think and I'm quite alert to that kind of thing, but I suspect there's a huge number of people who've only recently got a mobile phone, who've who get a text message into their mobile phone, and they really do believe it's HMRC or whoever it is. And I just wonder if focusing in on that group of older people, whether there's any value in trying to do something where you could actually start trying to measure the value of and the impact of the work that you're doing. It could be to City of London or to the Met or to MOPAC.
So I would say that, focusing in on certain cohorts of the people who may be not necessarily the most vulnerable in many cases, but actually where the impact can be really, really consequential, as John said earlier, for example, elderly people. That is one of the things which we started looking at that. Again, I go back to how, and I think I'll need to take this back and speak to Evidence Insights team about it, but it's how, because I agree that the focus on that all seems entirely correct and entirely sensible as a way forward. Exactly how you know and you assess what impact said campaign has had on all the people and what you would expect in a control group, the number of people to be victims versus the number of people who received this message versus the number of people who received and read it, and how you actually assess all of it. I'm not a sort of researcher or any of that, so I'll need to go back and think about it, but I don't disagree with the sort of concept of it. I just think actually really measuring these things is really quite difficult if it's not done at a really sort of large scale, but I think that is what we would all like to do. It's just how you do it, which, being entirely honest with the committee, I think is really quite difficult.
Thank you.
I'm so
Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair, and I will be very brief, but it's important I do put this question to MOPAC. So it's about the London Digital Security Centre, which was set up in 2016, as I understand, with initial funding of £327,000 to address cybersecurity concerns raised by SMEs. Now I recall, because I came to the Assembly in 2016, meeting the person who worked for it a couple of times. Since then, I've heard nothing at all. Does this body still exist? And if it does, what does it do?
So it does still exist. It is morphing as we sort of speak into the London Regional Cyber Security Centre, which Assistant Commissioner O'Doherty talked about earlier. It has produced, as Commander Roper was saying earlier, work over, so that was the CPI, but that's wholly owned, bizarrely, by the London Crime Prevention Initiative is wholly owned by what is at the moment the London Digital Security Centre, and that has produced the Cyber Aware training package for SMEs to enable them not to be more aware of the risks online and to be able to protect their business and avoid some of the consequences which Assistant Commissioner set out earlier. And as that morphs into the London Regional Cyber Security Centre, sorry, I'm getting tongue twisted here, that will take on and do exactly the work which the Assistant Commissioner was talking about earlier, involving some of the students, involving going out, working with people on their platforms and making sure that SMEs are better protected than they currently are.
Okay, so as I understand, a second stage of MOPAC funding was not ruled out. So what further public funds, GLF funds, have actually gone into this body? And more importantly, in terms of outputs, how many SMEs have actually accessed this cybersecurity package?
So I don't have those figures to hand for you, Assembly Member. I'll need to come back to you with the details of exactly how much money and exactly how many SMEs have accessed the training.
Because I mean, this thing was set up in 2016, Chair. I think I made my point, Chair, but...
Yes, you have. Perhaps, would you write to the committee about that,
Yeah,
please?
very happy to.
Thank you. Right. Okay, thank you, Assembly Member. We're now moving on to the final part of the meeting, and it's current approach to tackling online fraud. I accept we've touched on bits of this, and we're going to have to pick up speed a bit, so if everybody could bear that in mind. Questions are being started by Assembly Member Mayama.
Thank you, Chair. Before I start my questions, I just wanted to ask, you have the online frauds steering group, and as part of that is the case that Tech UK is part of that, and is that correct? Yeah, and so, and just for the benefit of people at home as well, they're a trade body that represents the tech industry. And I'm just thinking what Assistant Commissioner O'Doherty referred to about an example of a WhatsApp scam. It strikes me that you have the people as part of that group who do have a solution to, for example, putting in place measures to end those, if Meta or WhatsApp or Facebook are around the table. I just wonder whether that is a positive or a negative, and how you could be better using that. So I don't know if there are any thoughts that you might have on that particular point, really.
Forgive me, so I know about the online fraud steering group, and it has Tech UK, as you say. I believe it has UK Finance, and it has police personnel. A member from my management team attend the online fraud steering group. I only hear positive things. I know they're doing some really interesting work. I'm not close enough to the detail, but I do think I agree it has massive opportunity, because you've got industry, law enforcement, you've got the trade body all in the room discussing these issues. So I've got high hopes, but I've never personally been, but definitely hear good things about the work they're doing.
Okay, yeah, it's just as you were talking, I was thinking about other things, Amazon Web Services and so on.
Yeah.
That you as operational officers have a problem caused directly by some of these platforms in a separate room, because it's so diffuse. You've got people who are leading those platforms who are not offering up that connection. But that was just a reflection as you were talking. So my actual question is to the Met, MOPAC, and to you again, City of London Police, about what you think works well in the current system to prevent and tackle online fraud, and a little bit about how the interaction between the organisations could be improved. So perhaps I might build on it. If I start with the Met, though, this time.
Thank you. So I think, as we've described, as we've collectively answered, that the flow of collaborative working between the City of London providing us with the disseminations that were originally reported into action fraud, the work that we do within the Met in terms of responding to the referrals that we have in, both in terms of victim care, the investigation, the frontline support that we have in terms of the response of the officers, and also the crime prevention work. I think we've described a very good collaborative flow, and I think that does work extremely well. I think also we've reflected where we can do more in terms of that crime prevention space and that protection space, and I think that we work incredibly closely with the City of London Police to make sure that as they launch their campaigns, or as they review and adjust some of the processes of working, that we of course support them with that. It's quite difficult to talk entirely as the Met in an entity, because we're part of that systems-based approach, and we're part of that joint working with the City of London to support them as the national lead.
So, okay, what works well around the current approach to online fraud, as opposed to the more what's working well around fraud, so more around online fraud space. So I'm very alive to some of the negative rhetoric around action fraud. I think we all are. We all recognise that, for many of the victims, sadly, don't get the investigation they should get. We all recognise that despite very good progress, in my opinion, the last few years, we need to do much more around prevention and around investigation for victims of fraud. Absolutely all accepted. But I have to say, despite that negative rhetoric, I actually think the system we have for fighting online fraud works well. So for the only crime type where you've got all crime reporting in one place, I can't overestimate, I should say, the value.
Sorry, you've got the only what in play?
Sorry, the only crime where we have all crime reporting in one place, which is action fraud. And actually, that's so powerful because what it means is that we have a really good understanding of what the main frauds are, how they're being committed, and making sure that actually crimes go to the right forces for investigation. And it isn't what it used to be, which was a postcode lottery. So I think that's really, really valuable. It's really valuable having an understanding of what each police force should investigate for fraud, what the regional team should investigate for fraud, what we as lead force should investigate with fraud, and what the leadership role of the National Economic Crime Centre is. So I know that looking from the outside in, that's not simple and straightforward, but I can tell you as someone who worked in this space for over a decade, the system works well when it comes to fraud, but we need to be much better at what we do, and it needs more resourcing and more accountability and all the rest of it. But the actual system, a colleague of mine who's worked for many years described action fraud as an under-resourced, world-class concept. We're the only country globally, I think it's only Canada that has an action fraud, but we're the only country globally that has centralised reporting of fraud and cybercrime, and that is huge. And we get intelligence from the private sector flowing into our system daily. It doesn't happen anywhere else I've been. So I think the system is good. The work on campaigns, I think, is good, but we need to industrialise it. We need to reach more people. We need to measure impact. And as the other member mentioned, opportunities for working with victims to try and understand the impact we make and how we can reach people more in a relatable way. There's a danger in us in the police giving advice to elderly people that's not relevant or overly complicated. So there's a whole piece there. And I think what else we do well is some of the work we're doing with industry is really exciting, but it's at a low scale. So how do we industrialize that and do it in a much more systematic way? And just lastly, and John mentioned it before, the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit, it does some fantastic work. And the next 3 years, we have got the money, as Kenny mentioned, to roll that out to every police force in the country. So that means every victim to action fraud that's vulnerable will have dedicated support from policing. The other things we do well.
Just quickly, so without wanting to stop your flow, we have been briefed that, and based on the history, I suppose, of action fraud, one of the things that's been reported is that vulnerable victims get a good service, but everybody else, the vast majority, do not. And so I'm just wondering about what more could be done in that space, because obviously there is a difference between an elderly person who you would have additional measures, whichever bit of the public sector you'd be from, and somebody who does report, and then those detection rates for those kind of low-level crimes, low cost, if you like, online crimes, nothing really comes of it, and it's a mirror reflection of the trust and confidence issue in the wider Met. So just if you could focus on that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, no, definitely. So at the moment, we try to write a letter, which sounds dated, to every victim who reports to action fraud that's not going to get an investigation, to basically say, you're not going to get an investigation, this is the reason why, but we're going to use your crime for intelligence purposes to learn. Now, we know that's not good enough, and letters come late, sometimes they don't arrive at all. We've got money from the Home Office to actually design and implement brand new technology for action fraud by 2024. And what we're hoping to achieve is, and what we will achieve, if you're a victim of a fraud, you will be able to log on to the system and actually see where your crime report is in that process. So you'll be able to interact with action fraud and the police more frequently. And actually, if the outcome is not an investigation, the system will push prevention advice to you, and also help you prevent being victimized again in the future, but also explain why on this occasion you're not going to get an investigation. So actually, the visibility, the accessibility, the user-friendliness of the front-end system is a huge opportunity for us to build trust and confidence, despite the challenges we have around not enough is done around fraud investigation. But we have good support from the Home Office to achieve that in the next 2 years.
Okay, and so that description, it kind of talks about the interface, which obviously is different to if you get robbed on the street, you want to see a police officer. What are your detection rates like, and are they materially different to the issues that the police is having with sanction detection with online fraud, given that we started by saying that 15% of fraud is reported, so there's a lot that's not even being brought forward to you?
So if you consider that we send out about 5,000 crimes to police in every month, and approximately 7% of what we send out to policing gets investigated. Yes, that's slow, but actually that's the same detection rate as theft, which is 7% nationally. It's higher than burglary, but please don't think I'm saying that's good enough, because of course it's not good enough. But 7% is what gets investigated approximately. The last point I would say is if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, that was about 2%. Slowly going in the right direction, but more work to be done.
And just please tell me if I'm straying with someone else's question, but the additional funding that you're getting from MOPAC and the Home Office, that's really welcome. What's the likely impact, the anticipated impact of increasing that sanction detection rate from 7%?
Okay, so from a City of London Police perspective, the resource that we're putting in place to work in those regional organised crime units, so in 3 years we'll have 20 investigators, what we want them to do is work proactively. So instead of reacting to fraud investigations, and yes, of course, there'll need to be some of that, but we want them to look ahead and think about, okay, who are the networks and people committing fraud, and stop them before they do harm. In turn, that should, hopefully in theory, reduce fraudulent offending and threat, risk and harm we see in local communities, which should in turn reduce victim reporting. But equally, although we want them to work proactively, they still need to support local policing investigating those packages that come out from the National Fraud Intel Bureau or Action Fraud. So to finalise the response, I would say I would expect to see an increase in fraud investigations, but it's impossible to know by how much, be it 1%, 5%, I don't know. And the reality is that even with the investment and the improvements to action fraud, which will make a big difference, as long as we don't prioritise fraud across policing and wider law enforcement and resource it properly, we're not going to see the gains and improvements that we need to see.
Sorry, Assembly Member, can I just come in, because I've got a few points. I know we've talked a lot about what's good, but I just want to touch briefly on a few things which I think could be better within the system, if that's okay. And the first thing I would say is it relates to victims. In MOPAC, we run the user satisfaction survey, which looks at volume crime. We can extend that to fraud because of the way it's done. And actually, I think there would be a huge benefit in victim surveys, genuinely, not just allowing the victims to look at things and then say, well, are they okay, are they not? And then compare, be able to compare within that, well, were the victims more satisfied actually when it was held centrally at the City of London or when it was disseminated out to the Met? Were they more? So I think there would be a lot of learning which we could do that. I've touched already on the counting rules within the system, which I think are outdated, don't allow us to track things properly and make it very, very difficult to actually have a meaningful grasp on what performance is across the piece. I would say that the level of statistics produced by the Home Office, it was good they've now started doing it, but I think until they fix accounting rules, until they have a proper commitment to statistics, and they're actually able to allow us to compare performance using the statistics, and you can with some of the other stuff, the system is a little bit, it's not really being performance managed or cannot be performance managed in a meaningful way. I would say all of that goes back to, and this sounds a bit like I'm just making a sort of MOPAC point here, but I do think, given that this is a national level problem, I think 80% roughly of the frauds, you've got the victim and the offender who aren't within the same territorial force area. I think the Home Office does need, and government as a whole needs to invest more into this, both in terms of allowing this different routes potentially into policing to bring in the skills, but also in terms of the IT, the infrastructure, and the sort of surveying and public voice element of that. And finally, I think there is a lack, as I've talked about at the moment, of genuinely good quality research evaluation into what does work in the crime prevention space, which allows us to make a meaningful impact. And again, as I pointed out earlier, I think that needs to be coordinated and led at a national level. I don't have a particular view on whether best done by Home Office, College, in conjunction with City of London, but I think those are the sort of 5 or 6 elements I would highlight as could be improvements to the sort of system as a whole.
Yep. Did you want to come back in?
I'll just be very quick, because I've talked a lot. Completely agree with Kenny. Just a couple of points I really need to mention is we need to be smarter around the investment. And actually, you know, Home Office government is investing a lot in this space. One thing we're doing is, and actually Clinton to my left has led on this, is actually working with the banking sector to use dirty money taken from criminals and invest in that in policing to build capability. And interestingly, one of the projects we've used that money for is the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit. Last point for me is, as lead force, we need to really make sure we're helping policing. So, you know, at the moment we give Catherine John, you know, here's 800 frauds in the Met area or London area to investigate. What we want to do in the future is to say, John, Catherine, here's your 800 frauds, but actually 20% of these nominals are linked to violence. This 10% is linked to other Met priorities, to actually support them and recognise the pressure they're under, so we become more coordinated, and that's a big piece of work we're doing at the moment as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question for AGK, which is just your reflections on what more the Mayor could be doing to help older Londoners and help them avoid becoming victims of crime in the first place.
I think, as we've touched upon earlier with measuring the messages, who's getting reached and how people are getting reached, I think there's more that the Mayor could do to help the sharing of best practice and bring in community organisations, adult safeguarding teams, the Mayor and Community Watch and all those projects to at least try and get improved understanding of what's working or what's effective. I think this is something I talk about a lot, but going back to digital skills as well, that makes such a huge difference. And you know, the work that the Mayor does, the work that the London Recovery Board does, it does recognise the importance of digital skills for older Londoners, and you know, accessing those courses where you can get some stay safe online messages. But I think it does need to go much further. Obviously, the Mayor's got the devolved adult education budget, and when we saw the launch of the kind of marketing campaign for that work at the start of this year, we were quite disappointed that it didn't really seem to target older people in any particular way. So I think there's a lot more that can be done on digital skills, because it's such a crucial element, tying lots of different things together. I think there's, you know, there's lots of materials like the Met's little book of scams and all the different materials from all the projects, but there's possibly something the Mayor can do in terms of helping to get those messages out through GP waiting rooms, chemists, putting materials in people's prescription bags when they collect a prescription, using resident newsletters, community notice boards, in working with housing associations. So I think there's more that the Mayor can do in terms of disseminating those messages. We've done a little bit together on things like pension credit awareness, but I think there's much more that needs to be done to obviously reach those people that aren't being reached at the moment.
Thank you. And I'm just conscious the gentleman next to you, we haven't particularly asked any questions, but Assistant Commissioner O'Doherty said that you had worked with the financial sector, and I just wondered if, from your perspective, if there's anything that older Londoners could benefit from.
So thank you. Yeah, I mean, what the Assistant Commissioner was relating to was a project that we ran over the last year with Lloyds Banking Group, which was to release frozen funds that were used by criminals. And we utilised X amount of £1 million of that money to fund a number of projects, including some with Age UK. But it was a result of that we were able to then roll out a level 1 service to all of the rest of the country with 37 forces by the end of March, and likewise a cyber team within one of our other specialist teams. So I do think there is opportunity then. Obviously, London will probably benefit through that project anyway, but we're just in the process of reviewing that to then bring out hopefully a second wave of that project in the next year, which will allow other organisations to bid into, including victim support agencies.
Thank you.
May I
Assembly member,
I'm so sorry, may I just come in from London?
We're running very late, but very quickly.
Very swiftly. I was just reflecting both on the Assembly members' questions, but also the previous questions by Assembly member Russell in terms of what the Met's actually doing. And as I've explained previously, over the last couple of years, particularly during the lockdowns, we've really focused on our older communities. And I was also regularly invited to self-titled pensioners forums to give crime prevention advice and to discuss what they were doing and provide those mutual sort of supportive discussions so we could provide more crime prevention advice. I think from the previous Assembly member, I've talked about the community groups that we do talk to and the engagement that we do, and I think I'll make sure there's a specific reflection of the older community there. But I think your points in terms of what more can we do and how can we really get that crime prevention message out, particularly through our incredible citizens in policing family that we have within the Metropolitan Police Service, thousands and thousands of volunteers delivering crime prevention advice, working with our most vulnerable communities to help reinforce their awareness of this type of crime and others, which is proving to increase trust and confidence. I think that I will bring back that specific focus for the return I've already committed to.
Thank you.
I'll be really, really brief. This question is to Assistant Commissioner. The Social Market Foundation recently did a report on the scale of fraud and resources needed to counter fraud. They claim that due to the City of London being reliant on annual Home Office grants, it is disincentivized from long-term planning and investment. Would it help you, Assistant Commissioner, to get funding on a more consistent basis rather than being decided annually?
Yes, definitely. So to deliver our business that we discussed today, I think we have 5 different types of grants we get. There is actually some work underway with the Home Office to bring that into one grant and to have clarity about longer-term settlement. That would definitely help our business planning in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly member Garrett.
I have a couple of questions, if I may, about action fraud, and particularly, I understand there's a new system coming in terms of how it's a sort of, obviously it's a kind of volume operation dealing with volume crime. What the timescale for that is, what that new system will do, how in what ways will it be better, hopefully no ways in which it will be worse, and what impact in particular that victims might see as a result of that.
Thank you, Member Garrett. So, the first point I would say is, and I think this is good news, we're actually working with victims to help design the new system so that actually it meets needs and expectations. In terms of timeframes, and I think Clinton might correct me if I'm wrong, the overarching system will be implemented in 2024. We're actively going through a public-facing procurement process and have lots of suppliers interested, which is great. We are making changes to our new front-end system in the next few months, so that will go live early in the new financial year, and that's an improved online reporting tool that's more accessible and interactive to victims. And lastly, what will the new system deliver? So it will deliver a range of things. It will, first of all, improve the front-end experience. So first of all, if you want to use the online platform, you will have kind of a user space and be able to interact with the service electronically. Where is your crime in the system? Where has it gone, if anywhere? If it's not gone anywhere, why? And also use that to push crime prevention advice to a victim. In terms of when the crimes come in our system, the system will have the ability to push and pull data to different databases. That might be the Royal Mail, the Post Office, it might be HMRC. So we can start working in the bulk data space and start linking individual fraudsters into wider networks that we can target more systematically. We're hoping in the longer term to integrate those crimes we push out to policing, to integrate them with local crime police systems, so that actually if we push all those crimes into the Metropolitan Police, it runs it through the Met Crime Policing database, and it automatically starts drawing those links between fraudsters and other crime areas, so the Met can be targeted and more coordinated in its response to criminals from a fraud perspective. Lots more functionality. And just lastly, I would say, and it's already live, we have a chatbot function in the contact center. So we're now beginning to use machine learning and automation to drive efficiencies. And in its early design, the chatbot is now live. So if you are a victim of fraud, you're not wanting to speak to a contact handler, you're not vulnerable, and it's a relatively straightforward case. You can do it through a chatbot online. And in terms of efficiency, we believe that saves 4 members of staff. But lots more functionality, and I'd be happy to write to the committee and members with a more detailed summary of functionality we'll deliver in the future.
So in terms of the benefit, perhaps I shall ask the Met as well in a mo. In terms of the benefits then to police, because obviously my question was about victims, but you went on to talk about other forces. In practical terms, what will that mean for the police forces that are on the receiving end of your little data packages of fraud crimes that you've picked up?
So we're hoping to see a quicker dissemination of cases. That can sometimes be an issue where it can take a bit too long for cases to go out to police and to investigate. Second of all, the quality and the content of the reports we send out. The system we use, it's a bit dated at the moment, so more electronic, integrated with local force systems. For victims, quicker service, a more interactive service, a more user-friendly service. So they're the kind of main benefits we would expect to see for victims and forces.
So is this? Sorry, I'm trying to avoid the phrase middleware integration. But this is your computer system talking to other police forces' computer systems, so that the cases go into the system directly, and they don't arrive and then have to be somehow manually entered. Is that the difference we're talking about?
That's right. So at the moment, there's 3 components to the system: action fraud, online reporting, and contact center. National Fraud Intel Bureau that links the cases and prepares the packages to go out. And at the moment, we use dated means, such as emails, that access to data vaults to kind of send those cases out. So the idea is that we will integrate our output of crime into local force systems,
Okay, and from the Met end of things, how's that look from where you're sitting?
So we've talked already about the fact that that fraud criminality and cyber criminality is not independent, and often they're linked to other elements of activity. So the process that's just been described is actually already being tested as a proof of concept between the City of London Action Fraud and the Metropolitan Police Service. My team's led by John, to look at where we can link the intelligence from action fraud with other types of criminality, and how that means we can do an improved response. Also, where we can identify other victims and provide greater support to victims that are there. This means that we'll have a better, as we've already said, we'll have a better response, we'll identify more criminality that's happening, and crucially we'll disrupt more organised criminal networks who are utilising online activity to support their other types of criminality.
Thanks. And actually, sorry, another back to the City. You mentioned machine learning and AI, I think in the context of a chatbot, but if you have a very large volume of data, then actually machine learning is a very good way of combing through that for patterns. For example, picking up the fact there's a particular location, particular point on a data network or telecom network that is generating suddenly disproportionate amount of activity. Is that something that you're looking at as well? Is that you're doing now, or that you're doing in the future? Because we're fundamentally talking about volume crime, aren't we? And obviously, officers sitting at desks pouring through bits of paperwork is it's a sort of bucket fighting a sort of inferno, isn't it, from that point of view?
It's a brilliant question, because you're right, the chatbot function is just about the user interaction at the moment. When we look about our roadmap of what that technology needs to deliver in the future, in the medium to long term, automation is a massive part of that. And as you rightfully say, at the moment, if you give me a question around, well, Pete, a question earlier around who are the ages of people victimised by certain fraud, the system should be doing that automatically. It should be pushing and pulling data and producing that trend information, but also learning from it as well. and push into the business, this is a hotspot area for elderly victims of a certain fraud, go do a campaign or a day of action on this. At the moment, that's all human interrogation. And we rely upon the data we get from victims, which isn't always clear, of course, for good reason. So that is definitely a priority for us on our technological roadmap.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds like really good reason to recruit some police officers with a background in mathematics and computer science, possibly. Thanks, Chair.
Hey, you ended on that. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to the Met. Have you implemented all of the recommendations arriving from the HMIC FRS's 2018 fraud inspection and 2021 follow-up reports?
Yes, yes, we have, and we've not only implemented it. We are sort of pushing it even further than the recommendations themselves. I've talked about our cyber champions and our frontline policing units. I've talked about our work with our citizen policing portfolio to make sure that we upskill our volunteers as well, to provide that guidance and to make sure that they are skilled with the information when they talk to victims. We're also working very closely with the Metropolitan Police Special Constabulary to ensure that we can identify some of the skills that they have, reflecting the points about recruiting people and identifying people with particular skill sets. So we're making sure that we are attaching some of our Metropolitan Police Special Constabulary to our cybercrime units to also further implement the recommendations, particularly around the letters.
Are you able to write to me and just spell out what you've done for each of them? Because my information, it may be incorrect, as you've only done 10 of the 16 perhaps. So if you've done them all, maybe you could list out each one very clearly on a note to us, please.
Of course we can, absolutely.
Thank you. Moving on, also to you, please. How confident are you about the Met's ability to remain relevant and up to date with the rapidly developing nature of online fraud? And obviously a very succinct answer, because we've already discussed this in detail. My comment before I leave you to answer that is, earlier you talked about your focus of the Met on violent crime versus volume crime. And I'd add to various colleagues that have said this, of course violent crime is hugely important, and some online crime, of course, is violent crime, but volume crime per se is also incredibly important to Londoners.
So thank you for the question. I think I touched on some of this earlier. We have our cybercrime team that supports the economic crime investigation teams on a daily basis, and that team has very good reach into industry. And we are actually, I would suggest, are probably one of the furthest progressing forces in looking at how cyber-enabled fraud and indeed cyber-dependent fraud is committed. So I'm confident that we are in the right place and that we will continue to be so, and start to develop better and more current training for our staff. But as I said, it is a very fast-moving landscape for us.
Sure. Again, I'll ask you to write to us. Particularly the point I'd rake on that is you're almost, with greatest respect, marking your own homework, and going back to Assembly Member Garrett's point about you're not particularly the most IT specialist part of the public sector. Okay, I said that. Could you write to us in terms of how you're benchmarking what you've just said in terms of best practice with public and private? Don't answer now because we're running out of time, sir. Thank you. And I'll move on. My final question is to MOPAC. Kenny, how is the Mayor represented on and contributing to the online fraud steering group? He does seem rather invisible as an individual, but I'm sure you're going to tell me the Deputy Mayor is all over this.
Those weren't the words which are about to come out of my mouth, but what I was about to say was actually this is a sub-board of the actual, I think, another Home Office chair board called the Economic Crime Strategy Board, and we have not been invited to sit on these boards. It's something which I'm going to be speaking to the Home Office about. I'm not sure if it was previously the PCC in Lincolnshire who was the lead in this, Mark Jones. I'm not sure if he's still involved in that, but it's not necessarily the way it works. I think what we would want to take out from that is the learning and make sure that we're able to feed in on that. And I don't think when the Home Office doesn't invite us to sit on boards or other things, it's a fair comment to say that the Mayor in that respect is invisible.
would you like to finish, Chairman? I'll leave it there because we are short of time, but I'm not exactly overwhelmed by that response, particularly as the Mayor and Deputy Mayor are all over this, but because of time, I'll leave it there and maybe we'll come back to it.
Well, I'd like to know more about the board itself, but do you know who actually sits on the board?
Which board? The Economic Crime Strategy?
Yeah, the one, yes, the one we were just, the online fraud steering group.
I don't have I think Assistant Commissioner Doherty will be able to give you more detail on the exact.
That would be interesting.
Just to say, so a fraud reform programme driven by the Home Office, number 10 interested in a 10-year fraud strategy. One of the biggest things we have to improve is governance. To answer your question, the Economic Crime Strategic Board is, I think, supposed to be chaired by the Home Sec. I think it's met 3 times in the last couple of years. It will have, I believe, the Security Minister, Policing Minister, PCC, who's now Mark Shelford from Avon and Somerset, I think James Thompson, Corporation Police Committee Chairman, and others, personally not being myself. And the Online Fraud Steering Group is, I think, policing, National Crime Agency, trade body Tech UK and others. But I think we're going to see some changes to governance because it's a very big and complex landscape at the moment. And we just say, Chair, Deputy Mayor of London met recently with my boss, Commissioner, who is the police and need for fraud and cyber. Sophie Linden is really interested. There's going to be regular meetings with her going forward. So we are joined up.
Okay, I think we all have to be interested. Fraud is being rising in a very worrying way. As you haven't spoken yet, Assembly Member de Val, a very quick one because we're running out of time.
Thank you, Chair. On the basis of the previous answers, would it be appropriate for MOPAC or MPS to be represented on that organisation, given the level of activity that would be taking place around this particular crime and its facets? Should we be making representations in our response to this that actually, MOPAC should be invited?
So we would certainly be happy to be involved. I think what's most important from our side is that the APCC system works well and that they are collecting the information that we are able to feed in our views at the national level through that organisation and have that fed in. We're always going to say as MOPAC that we want more direct access to the people making the decisions at the top of the tree, so that would be helpful, and we will always do that. But I think the APCC system of representatives, for example, the Deputy Mayor is the representative on performance and the representative in victims, and she corrals the views of people there, and if it's Alex Shelbrooke across and even in Somerset, then we will be feeding in that way through him. And as far as I can see, that system works pretty well, actually.
Look, no disrespect to the other participants at the table, and they've probably got good cause to be sitting around the table, but we are one of the largest police services in the country, and, in the sense that you would have thought that would have meant that there should be a place for us around the table. It seems there's something lacking here. Maybe, Chair, if we could conclude that as part of our deliberations in terms of if we should be included or not, and try and seek that in terms of the final recommendations that we might put arising from these discussions.
I agree, given that nearly 25% is in London, I think, from the last thing I've read, so I agree with that. Okay, I just would like to thank everybody. I think it's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much, it really did. You only lost me on cryptocurrency. Beyond that, I was there with you. And Commander, thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry you only came in on one bit, but it was with good news that you're using dirty money very efficiently to fund good things. So thank you very much for that. So I'd like to therefore thank all of you, thank all of our guests for attending this meeting and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, the 23rd of March, 2022 at 10 a.m. I have no other urgent business, so it concludes today's meeting.